3 a.m, she wakes up, chucks a pillow at me, and says, Aryeh, we've lived our lives based upon the wrong philosophy all of this time.
Oh my gosh.
And I turned to her, I'm like, what? Right? We're not exactly getting a normal night's sleep at this point in time. She goes, who are we to decide what the right time is? When there's a right opportunity, it's your job to make it the right time for that right opportunity. She says, God opens the door, it's your job to figure out how to walk through it. And says, you should go ahead and take this job right after Shabbos. Go and tell David and Tammy, if they'll still take us, we want to come.
Welcome back to Inspiration for the Nation. I'm Yaakov Linger, and I'm so excited for today's episode. I always knew about the Abraham Accords since they happened a few years ago, but I didn't really know, I still didn't know before this episode, the nitty-gritty, what actually happened on that iconic flight, and so much more, and I got to sit down with someone, I think he said the line in it, an ordinary person with an extraordinary opportunity. And I think that is the story of all of our lives. We feel so ordinary, and we have the tremendous ability to do things extraordinary. And it's not just, we all of us don't have the option to create a plan to create peace in the Middle East, but we all have a mission and we all have a purpose. And Reb Aryeh Lightstone is a true delight with so many funny moments and inspirational moments in his life and his career. And I think, personally, he's one of the unsung heroes. You always hear about all the others that were involved in the treaty, as they should be mentioned, but he's someone that if you look it up, he was there, and without him, it definitely would not have happened. And I cherished this conversation, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. This episode is in memory of Shimon David ben Yaakov Shleima and Miriam Sarah Bas Yaakov Moshe, and you're going to hear a little more about one of my favorite podcasts, 36. Here is the episode. We can all use some inspiration to help us overcome the obstacles we encounter in our lives. Get ready for thrilling conversations about struggle and triumph with those in pursuit of making a positive impact in this world. I'm Yaakov Langer, and you're listening to Inspiration for the Nation. I'm here with Rabbi Aryeh Lightstone from, did I pronounce your name right?
Yep.
Okay. All the way from Renana, but you didn't start off in Renana. Can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Sure. Now, most people don't start in 1881, but I'm going to do that.
Okay. I'm thinking Beshefkin's podcast.
Oh.
He has a different...
He likely did, yes.
But 1881 is a different year. Yes. It's close to his 1840.
Right. No, 1881 was when my ancestors were sent from Russia to Cotopaxi, Colorado. And there were 18 families that were sent. And why is that relevant? It's relevant because my family stayed in Colorado. Now, they moved from Cotopaxi, eventually made it to Pueblo, and then ultimately winding up in Denver. But, growing up in Denver, it was the concept of if you don't do it, it's not going to get done. So my parents built a school. My uncle and aunt built the shul. When I was growing up, if you didn't lane every third week, there was no Kriyas HaTorah, right? If you didn't have a minyan, there was no minyan. It was up to you to be able to get stuff done. And so I started in Denver, went back east to Yeshiva University, then Shalvim, then Yeshiva University, and then Smicha from there. And long, windy road from there to wind up in Renana.
Wow. Okay. So I want to go back to what you mentioned before, when you were a kid. What does that mean? That you had to pull together your minyanim and all that?
So I went to a school that my parents also wound up building. It was not a religious school. It was a Jewish school, very Zionistic school. And there were religious kids in the school, but we were the minority, not the majority. And so they're everything that we wanted to be able to have, whether it was Shabbatonim with a Orthodox minyan, Shabbatonim with kosher food that we'd be able to eat, that was up to us to be able to do that. So the kids, believe it or not, at the age of 13 or 14, would go into the kitchen on Thursday night and make the food for the Shabbaton. That way it would be appropriate. We wanted to, I think it started maybe 6 months before my bar mitzvah, we decided we need a minyan in the school, and we got together. There were 16 of us, and every morning, if you wanted to sleep in past 6:30, because the minyan was before school started, there was no minyan that day. So every morning you woke up, you knew that if you didn't show up on time, you weren't going to have this minyan that we wanted to work for.
I would be petrified to have that upbringing, but ultimately, even though this sounds, I guess, super annoying, but ultimately, those type of tools was probably really helpful in your life, that mindset of, if I'm not going to do it, it won't happen.
Yeah, and from an annoying perspective, yeah, nobody wants to wake up an hour and a half earlier than you have to for school.
Also, you don't want to be, you're the guy. If you don't miss it, like the other 9 are like, well, come on, buddy. Like, what's up?
Correct. But the advantage is you're the guy.
Right.
And therefore, you wake up every morning, and if you're curious whether you matter or not, which is something that middle school and high school kids debate all the time, you know at the very least you matter for that morning, right? Nothing happens without you. We never got to a mincha mini, and I'm curious why we didn't invest in that. But
guys are like, we did chakras. That's enough.
Correct, more or less. We played ball in the afternoon. But yeah, no, for chakras, and that was the first thing. When your alarm went off, you were ready to go.
Wow. Okay. And then at what point did you go to NCSY?
So I was invited by a guy, Gotch Yudin, actually, who came out to Denver to run NCSY in Denver on that. Maybe he came out once every 2 to 3 months. He said, hey, you would be great on NCSY Kollel. So that's actually 25 years ago this summer. I was debating what to do that summer, and Gotch Yudin said, you got to come on NCSY Kollel. And that was one of the, as Winston Churchill describes it, the hinge of history. Now, nations did not pivot based upon that decision, but my life pivoted based upon that decision. Spent the summer on NCSY Kollel, and that informed where I went for college, where I went for yeshiva, ultimately who I married, who my friends are. Most of my friends today, I can trace back either to NCSY Kollel or the people that I met 2 to 3 years after that.
Wow. Can you imagine your life if you didn't go to NCSY? Like where you'd be?
I would speculate about that, but I feel that my wife and kids would be disappointed.
Okay, that's fair. That's fair. Okay, and what was your role at NCSY?
Oh, so, I mean, in Denver, there were 8 of us who ran it, so you got to be whatever position you wanted to be. So we probably rotated president, treasurer, vice president, whatever looked good on the college application for that. But the role was, again, if you didn't do it, it didn't happen. On NCSY Kollel, I was a camper. And there was, I don't know how well your audience knows it, but 200 high school kids who go and spend the summer learning, and then about 10 of us who come from backgrounds that this was maybe our first experience with meaningful learning. So I was one of those kids who was sort of part of that. I didn't realize that they created a separate program for us within Kollel. It took me maybe the second week to realize, one of these things does not like the other. But it was the warmth and the embrace. And, on the basketball court, there was no difference whether you came from this background or from that background. And in the Beit Midrash, in the Beis Medrash, there was a difference, but there was a difference that you got more attention, not less. So that was pretty cool.
That is awesome. Okay, so at what point in your life did you transition to, I don't want to say politician, but the DC world? Because, into that role, I guess. Yeah,
so following NCSY Kollel, then YU, and then Smicha, I was the assistant rabbi at a couple places. I had the honor and privilege of running NCSY in New York for almost a decade, and was incredibly passionate about connecting Jewish youth to Judaism. So many of them are disappearing, certainly in the public school system, so spent every waking hour working on that. My wife, God bless her, there wasn't a Shabbos where we didn't have 20 high school kids in our house for a meal or two, or possibly even sleeping there. And so that was fantastic. Once we got, I don't want to say tired from that, because you can never get tired from that, but where we felt that other people could do the job as well, if not better than us. So we moved on. I, like all good rabbis, went into multifamily real estate. And then while that was transitioning into earning a living, I got a phone call from a very dear friend and mentor who said the Iran deal is bothering him. Could I help him build a super PAC? And I knew about the Iran deal. I did not know what a super PAC was. But with his guidance and mentoring, which is one of the things that I've been blessed to find at nearly every stop that I've taken on the way, we built a super PAC and spent 2014 working to get the Republican control of the Senate for the sole purpose of voting down the Iran deal. Now, we were successful of getting Republican control of the Senate, but we were not successful in shooting the Iran deal down. And then we moved on to work on states to have sanctions against Iran. That folded into some anti-BDS. And then sort of once you got stuck in the Washington vortex, the swamp, if you will, it was difficult to get out because it's exciting. It's not all great, but it's exciting, and you have this tremendous sense of access to power. So it was very interesting, and one thing led to another. I supported a guy named Marco Rubio who ran for president. It was a exciting campaign to be very close to the candidate and travel around the country. A couple times I got to speak for him at various different
Did anyone ever tell you kind of could be like a stunt double for him?
So I got to tell you, we were speaking in Las Vegas at the caucuses, and he spoke at a caucus. It's not like a primary. You go and you speak in like this big gym, and each candidate gets to speak, but they've got lots of gyms around the state, and so you can't speak in every gym. That's not possible. So they have different candidates pick different caucuses to speak at, and then they'll have surrogates go speak on their behalf. Now, the goal of the surrogate isn't to look like the candidate. The goal of the surrogate is to share the candidate's message. And I was speaking in one of the places. Ted Cruz showed up to that location, and then President Trump, candidate Trump at the time, also showed up to that location. And I was the fifth speaker speaking on behalf of Marco Rubio. Now, after Cruz and Trump came, nobody was all that interested in hearing what I had to say, but they gave me my 7 minutes of allotment, and I spoke for the 7 minutes. And after that, people came over to take selfies with me, thinking that I was indeed Marco Rubio, which leads you to question. These are the people who are spending their night to come out to the caucus who now think that I was Marco. So, okay, voters, not always exactly on point.
That's incredible. Well, talking about that, do you get nervous? Do you get nervous speaking in front of so many people, representing what, Rubio or whatever you're believing in?
No, it's great to, as long as you have confidence in what you're speaking about, you have the ability to deliver the message, hopefully articulately. But this is something that I learned already from Denver from a young age. I remember I gave my bar mitzvah speech when I was 13, and 3 weeks later, they asked me to give the drasha for the shul. Now,
really?
Granted, not a large shul, 100, 150 people there, but every 4, 5, 6 weeks, you would get up and you would give the drasha. Now, were all of them good? Undoubtedly not, right? But it gave you the confidence to get up and to speak. And even more importantly, it gave you the requirement that when you got up, you had to prepare. Because if you have the opportunity to have people pay attention to you, you have to give them something or else you're not going to get invited back.
Right. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So you're in the political arena. How's your family taking this?
So my family was fairly convinced I was going to go make money. And I think they were pretty excited about that.
Okay.
The volunteer job of not making money, that was less exciting. And we had 3 little kids at the time my wife was expecting. Marco dropped out. Again, there was so much enthusiasm when he was running because they were also then connected. Everything I do closely with my family. I describe that in my book. They're part and parcel of everywhere that I go, as they should be. But when he dropped out, we had a pretty serious conversation that maybe my dabbling in politics was enough, and let's move on. And if it wasn't for coincidence or siyata dishmaya, probably more accurately put, I never would have come back to politics.
Right. Okay. So it wasn't the end of your political career.
It wasn't, because then we could talk about other things, which would be equally exciting. I've spent a lot of time talking about politics, but sort of to get to that specific point, David and Tammy Friedman, who lived not terribly far from here, were friends and mentors of my wife and myself as soon as we moved to Long Island, helping us with NCSY, helping us figure out the neighborhood, inviting us for meals. Very, very kind, very sweet, very generous. David had been a supporter of Donald Trump because they were friends. And when Donald Trump won the election, David was almost immediately nominated to be the ambassador. And you should read all about this in his book, Sledgehammer. He gives you a blow-by-blow, pun intended, of his entire career with Donald from the beginning of business all the way through politics. Mine was different. I didn't know Donald Trump at all. I knew David Friedman. And when Donald won, I texted David like everybody else who knows David and wished him congratulations and mazal tov. It was highly unlikely that his friend was going to be the president of the United States of America, and he stuck with them from highly unlikely to now it was happening. And he invited me to go with on part of the confirmation process, and myself and several other of his friends sort of worked with him as you go through the U.S. Senate confirmation process. And towards the end of that, he turned and he invited me and my family if we would come along and serve as his senior advisor to him as the ambassador. Now, just in context, when Marco dropped out, my wife and I were lucky enough to be expecting, have a baby. We bought a new house. I bought a new business.
In the 5 towns?
In the 5 towns. Not far from where we are right now.
Cool.
And we had a healthy baby girl, or so we thought. And maybe 5 or 6 days into Atara's life, she stopped eating and stopped swallowing, and that's obviously a major issue for a 5, 6-year-old, a major issue for anybody.
Right, yeah, eating's important.
Yes, and as you can tell.
You're good.
And rushed her to the hospital, and she spent 5, 6, 7 days in the hospital. It was on day number 8 where she came home, and just also in context, the day after she was born, we moved into a new house. So we went to new house, to new baby, to baby in the hospital. We had never all slept together under the same roof of said new house. It was on a Wednesday or Thursday night. And we're all in the same house, and David asked if I would go down to D.C. with him, and I'm riding the train. Back from D.C., we had meetings that day, and he invited, at that moment, my wife and I to join him and Tammy on this really incredible journey. And then I let him know what had been going on in my life at that point in time. And he's like, oh,
Yeah.
This is going to be a tough sell.
Join where?
Into Israel. When
To
he
move
would be
to
the
Israel.
ambassador. To move to Israel.
You just bought your house, just had your fourth kid.
Correct.
There's some complications going on.
That is
He's like,
correct.
by the way,
Yes.
do you want to pick up and come to Israel?
Yes. And I had been angling for an opportunity to do something because I knew from 8 years prior he was a special, incredible person, and to have the chance to work with him in the proximity of the things that he was going to be doing was going to be a unique moment in history. How unique? I did not know, but I knew it was going to be unique. And I come home on that Thursday evening, my wife looks at me and says, what's bothering you? And I'm like, oh, no chance. I'm not going to tell her this, right? This is not the moment to raise this. So I decided in my mind I would politely decline on Saturday night. After Shabbos, I'd go over and say something. Friday morning, wake up. She looks at me, what's on your mind? Nothing's on my mind. Go through Friday, whatever the stuff is in a new house with a new baby and all of these things. Friday night, we have dinners, our first Shabbat dinner, Shabbos dinner in our house, our new house with all of our new family now, and get the kids to sleep. That's what we were able to do when my oldest was 7, right? That was fun. And then my wife turns to me and says, okay, what's eating you? And I told her the circumstances. I said that David and Tammy invited us to go on this very special journey, but I was going to tell him no, because my wife and I had a philosophy of right opportunity at the wrong time equals the wrong opportunity. And she goes, well, how do you even bring this up right now? Don't you know? I'm like, I know.
That's why I stole.
Correct. I wasn't planning on telling you, but you asked on the 5th time. I felt that it was appropriate to tell you. She goes, yeah, you're correct. Right opportunity, wrong time. This is the wrong opportunity. I'm happy you mentioned it to me. Let's go to sleep. Go to sleep. 3 a.m, she wakes up, chucks a pillow at me, and says, Aryeh, we've lived our lives based upon the wrong philosophy all of this time.
Oh, my gosh.
And I turned to her, I'm like, what? Right? We're not exactly getting a normal night's sleep at this point in time. She goes, who are we to decide what the right time is? When there's a right opportunity, it's your job to make it the right time for that right opportunity. She says, God opens the door. It's your job to figure out how to walk through it. And says, you should go ahead and take this job right after Shabbos. Go and tell David and Tammy if they'll still take us, we want to come. And, there's a conversation at 3 a.m. with your wife. Woke up the next morning, she looked at me, I looked at her. We didn't say anything. Have Shabbos lunch, she looks at me, I look at her. We didn't say anything. And we're sort of playing this game of chicken. I don't think she wanted to say it out loud while we were going to all be awake. But Motzi Shabbos, I got in the car, I drove over to David Friedman's house, has sat with him and Tammy and said, my wife has told me this is the right time for us, so let's make it happen. And he graciously accepted us, and it was a whirlwind journey ever since that moment.
Okay, I don't want to get to the journey, but how badly, from 1 to 10, did you want to do it? Like, were you a 10 or were you a 5 maybe, and like you wanted to stay around the 5 towns?
Can you be an 11 and a 2 at the same time?
I guess so, but meaning you were so excited, but you're also, I guess, petrified to do it?
That's exactly right. Nobody knew what this was going to be, right? I don't think that anybody really knew what an ambassador does, right?
I still don't.
Okay, well, we can talk about that.
Yeah.
But, there was an opportunity to work with the ambassador, and the only thing that I knew was that he was close with the president. And we also knew that the U.S. Israel relationship had been severely damaged by the previous presidency, and it was typified by in December of 2016, after the election, when Obama was not going to be the president moving forward, our failure to veto the resolution at the United Nations, which essentially declared that all property on the other side of the Green Line is illegally occupied territory, including the Kotel, including the Western Wall, including the holiest sites to the Jewish people. This is something that the United States of America had always vetoed at the UN Security Council, and we abandoned our ally in that time of need by a lame duck government. So that was ridiculous. So I knew that whatever it was that David was going to do was going to be exciting, and it wasn't going to be what had occurred beforehand.
Wow. Okay, so then how much after you saying we're in did you move to Israel?
So the we are in conversation happened end of February. He was confirmed in March. He got there in May. I began my onboarding process with the State Department in June. Took a long time to move the paperwork along. They were not all that excited about hiring me.
Why?
Because there aren't that many political ambassadors that get appointed, maybe 50, 60, 70. Very few of them get a second political appointee. So before most of our posts to other countries that are very important were appointed, they had already appointed me as a second appointee. This speaks to David's relationship with the president, that he was able to do something that no other ambassador was able to do. And because nobody was going to mess with David, because Ambassador Friedman had that relationship with the president of the United States of America. So they claimed to me they rushed my paperwork. I don't know what took so long with the paperwork, but by June, I was sitting there at the State Department, and they send you away to this camp for new trainees who are going to be diplomats, but trainees who are going to go to scary Middle Eastern posts. So like Benghazi, Libya, and like Afghanistan and Pakistan and Iraq and all of these places, and me going to Tel Aviv. And they take you away for 5 days to the hinterlands of West Virginia, where they practice what happens if the embassy gets overrun, what happens if your driver gets shot, what happens if as you're driving down the road you run into an ambush. And you got to learn really cool things. Thank God none of them have ever been applicable, but I know how to drive a car through a roadblock, which I actually contemplated when I was in Sudan negotiating the Abraham Accords and my driver made a wrong turn. So that actually was almost relevant for a second.
Okay, wow.
And you got to learn all these sort of really cool things with camp. They would practice following you at night to see if you can pick up a tail.
Really?
As though you were being spied upon.
I feel like you're like an American version of James Bond in a certain way.
No, I was very bad at both evading the tail and recognizing the tail. Everybody else went out to like bars and to hang out and everything. I went to the one supermarket in town that had one aisle that had 2 kosher items. That is where I went
like
every
matzah and
evening.
gefilte fish.
That is correct. That is where I went every evening. So I was easily tailed at that point in time, and you always had to come back, and shul was 2 hours away. So
wow.
I was a pretty easy tail, but I did discover that the only other person who was on the same block as the shul was the guy who was following me. So at that point in time, I was able to isolate him. But it was a fascinating experience, and that was the first time that I met American patriots who were willing to travel anywhere in the world to be able to go serve the United States of America. There's still a Marine who I'm friendly with today, who was part of this, who went to go run the Marines who protected our embassy in Kenya. And he and I maintained a very close relationship, and I was just in awe that a guy from Nebraska decided to serve his country and then sign up for additional service to go protect our diplomats, in this particular case in Kenya.
Interesting. Well, is there any practical tips that you learned from this camp that you could give over to people?
I've driven on Central Avenue. I've also driven on Avenue J. I'd say most of the drivers there could probably give tips to the diplomats on how to negotiate tricky and dangerous situations.
Really?
Yeah. I'll tell you the one lesson that I think is really important that I learned. If you say something to somebody, that might be the only impression that you have to give them forever. And I'll give you an example of that. I met with somebody who was going to the embassy in Tashkent, which I believe is in Uzbekistan. And we had one lunch together, which meant that she ate lunch and I had a cup of coffee on the saltines. And we spent one lunch together, and I completely and totally forgot about that lunch. But she got posted to Israel 3 years later, my last year there. And in the process of coming there, she said because she wanted to work with myself and Ambassador Friedman. And the question was, why did she want to work with myself and Ambassador Friedman? Because she remembered a conversation that I had bragging about Ambassador Friedman and how great this was. Now, this was on day 4 of me eating coffee and saltines, with being far away from a minion, without having I could have been complaining about the fact that Ambassador Friedman went to this camp for exactly 1.5 hours. I spent 5 days there. There could have been a lot of other things I could have said at that point in time, and that would have affected her entire impression of David, of myself, of Orthodox Jews, of the policy that we had towards Israel. I never thought I was going to run into this lady again, but apparently the one conversation that we had such an impact that 3 years later she wanted to come and work with us.
What was the conversation?
I don't remember it. But it
was impactful.
It gives you the value of what you say to people, and sometimes we don't consider it impactful, but I think it matters.
Right. Yeah, that is really beautiful. So let's get into the Abraham Accords. First off, for someone that doesn't know, because I definitely have younger listeners, what is the Abraham Accords on a basic level?
In order to understand Middle East policy prior to President Trump, you have to understand that there were 2 competing values. The United States of America wants to stand with Israel, but we want to stand with Israel up to a point. Why a point? Because the Palestinians have what we consider the Arab and Muslim world veto. So if we go too far with Israel, we're going to wind up with an issue with 75 other countries that we don't really want to pick a fight with. And their number one foreign policy issue is they don't love Israel. Our number one foreign policy issue is we're supposed to love Israel, but those two things came to a head up to a point. Where was the tip of the spear for that? It was the recognition of Jerusalem and moving our embassy to Jerusalem. So that was the sort of point of greatest contention. And because this was the case, the entire world felt that all of the problems in the Middle East were based upon what they call the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And only if you solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict will all of the other things in the Middle East fall into play like a nice game of dominoes. It's baloney. This was an unfounded philosophy, but it was one that we doubled and tripled and quadrupled down on. So this was what people thought made sense. David Friedman, Jared Kushner, Avi Berkowitz, all appointed by President Trump, decided to look at the region differently. And I'm very clear in my book, if there are architects, I wasn't an architect, I was a subcontractor. I got a chance to work directly for the architects, but I was a subcontractor. But I got to watch what they were designing, and what they designed is says, look, not every decision that we make is going to be popular with all of our allies, but we're going to be clear about what we do, and then our allies are going to be able to make a decision about how they want to then react. We're going to remove confusion and chaos from the Middle East. We're going to bring clarity and efficiency to the way we make decisions. And essentially, from where I was sitting, this all started on December 6, 2017, when President Trump recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. I was honored to sit in David Friedman's living room with David and Tammy, my wife and my in-laws, and obviously David, as the president read the speech, recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. Now, I knew exactly what he was going to say, because David Friedman was reading along with him the speech that David had written the vast majority of. So at that point in time, if people want to understand somebody who has influence, David Friedman was the primary actor in the recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, other than the president. Now, the president deserves all the credit. He was the one who ran, and he was the one, if it didn't work out well, would have received all the repercussions from that. But why did he recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel? There's a great story your listeners should know. When Menachem Begin, who was the first right-wing Prime Minister of Israel, so he went to England to meet with Margaret Thatcher, who was, the Iron Lady. She was the right-wing Prime Minister of the UK. So before their first meeting, he was asked in the press, are you going to ask Margaret Thatcher to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel? And he hems and he haws, and he says, I will if she asks me to recognize London as the capital of the United Kingdom. What was the point? England, or the United Kingdom, doesn't make Jerusalem the capital of Israel. Washington, D.C. doesn't make Jerusalem the capital of Israel. Israel made Jerusalem the capital of Israel. It's their sovereign country. It's their sovereign decision. Now, why didn't we recognize it? Right? From 1995, there was the Jerusalem Embassy Act, which required the president to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, to move our embassy to Jerusalem, the capital of Israel, and move our ambassadors home to the capital of Israel. This was in 1995. Every president that ran for office promised to follow that law. Every president did not follow that law, Republicans and Democrats. Till President Trump got there on December 6, 2017, he recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. December 7th, 2017, I drove to Jerusalem and met then Governor Rick Scott, now he's the Senator Rick Scott from Florida, and welcomed him to Jerusalem, the capital of Israel. I'm the first U.S. diplomat to ever say those words with the legal standing of the United States of America. 5 months later, David Friedman, on behalf of President Trump, opened up the United States Embassy in Jerusalem, the capital of Israel. A historic day that I will remember forever. It was incredibly powerful, and because of David and Tammy, myself and my family were able to participate firsthand in that historic day. Now, why do I mention that as explaining the Abraham Accords? Those decisions were not popular in the United Arab Emirates. They were not popular in Saudi Arabia. They were not popular in Morocco. But do you know what they were? They were understood. This was the law of the United States of America from 1995, and President Trump acted on that law. Once he acted on that law, there was a difference in between how the U.S. Israel relationship was prior to that and how there will be forevermore going forward. There was no longer this artificial division that says we're going to be friends with Israel to a point. We're going to be friends with Israel because they are the greatest ally that we have in the region. And they heard it in the UAE, and they heard it in Bahrain, and they heard it in Saudi, and they heard it in Morocco. And now these countries have a decision to make. They want to get closer to the United States of America. It became clear that getting closer to Israel was going to be part of that. And on August 13th, 2020, I was invited by Jared and Avi and David Friedman and a good friend of mine, Eric, to come into the Oval Office for the first phone call in between President Trump, Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed, who's the leader of the United Arab Emirates, and Prime Minister Netanyahu was the Prime Minister of Israel in August of 2020, and they had a phone call. And if you want to know how phone calls work in between world leaders, they work the same way as you and I having a conference call. You don't know when they're on the line. They're talking over each other. None of these guys are used to anybody talking over them. It's the President of the United States of America, the Prime Minister of Israel, and the leader of the United Arab Emirates. President Trump ultimately brought them to order. They had a conversation. It was really fantastic. And I'll remember forever that Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed, the leader of the United Arab Emirates, said, "Today is the day that we make the Middle East that we want it to be, not the Middle East that we were given." Wow. And that's a paraphrase. He said something powerful about, we're going to determine our future. We're not going to let our past determine our future. And that set off a chain of events that in 123 days, Israel normalized with 5 countries it did not have relations with: the United Arab Emirates, the Kingdom of Bahrain, the Kingdom of Morocco, Sudan, and the Republic of Kosovo. And what that did was told the world that Israel and Palestine and the Palestinians are not the source of the problems. It told the world that Israel is the source of solutions. If you want to be advanced technologically, militarily, from an intelligence perspective to get closer to us, the United States of America, get closer to Israel. And 5 countries in 123 days made that decision. And there's so many more waiting in the wings in order to change the Middle East moving forward.
We'll be right back to this week's episode with Aryeh Lightstone, Rabbi Aryeh Lightstone. But he is, and you'll hear what he's about to say. It's going to blow your mind. He's a great guest on my show. You know whose show he could be also a great guest on? Pick a number from 1 to 10. 36? Did I guess it right? Probably not. But 36 is an incredible podcast, and Justin Hyatt is an incredible host. If you ever want to start a podcast of your own, I highly recommend you listen to Justin, and you will pick up what it means to be a great podcast host. He's calm, he's cool, he's collect, he does his research, and also you feel how excited he is to talk to his guests and to really bring out their strengths and who they are. The idea of 36 is this, I'm gonna make it sound cool, this ancient idea, which it is, that there's 36 people in each generation that are totally keeping up and transforming the generation, and we don't know who these tzaddikim, these special righteous people are. And in fact, the people themselves don't even know who they are. You might be one of those people. If you're like me, you're like, I'm definitely not that person. But you might be, you could be. And it's a great podcast. And what better way to learn about the podcast that you should be listening to than reading the reviews? So I'm going to read 1 or 2 of these reviews that I thought were beautiful and really conveys the beauty of 36. Hyatt's inquisitiveness and his search for positivity and light in other people produces storytelling that is inspiring and delightful. The podcast leaves me with a feeling of warmth that lasts the whole day. Who doesn't want that? The altruistic nature and care of Justin's guests is awe-invoking and makes me feel like I can be doing more to benefit the world. Such a good listen, and can't wait to hear more. I hope this isn't capped at just 36 episodes. That is, whoever wrote that review, could you please write a review for my show? Someone else left. Love the show, easy on the mind and ears, positive, and introduces people with a unique and compelling stories. Last one I'm going to read, and there's so many of these, a wonderful and broad selection of interviewees. Justin conducts his interviews with kindness and respect and draws out those he is speaking with. After each interview, I wish I could meet Justin and his new friends. Yes, that's right, folks. If you like podcasts because you're watching or listening to this, you always want another great podcast to listen to, and I highly recommend Justin's podcast. The one downside is you will be wanting more, and you'll be like, okay, you didn't get to 36 yet. You're approaching there. What's going to happen? That's the only downside for the podcast. You're going to want more of it, and it's also the perfect length, the perfect amount. You know, I don't know. Joe Rogan does like 4-hour podcasts. Joe Rogan, if you're listening to this, I mean no offense, but Justin has the great, sweet amount of time to listen to. It's a great listen, and most importantly, you walk out feeling like you learn something, you know something about someone else, and it's very reflective. You could take the ideas from it, and Justin does a great recap and kind of transform your life, make your life better. So what better way than listening to 36? You can listen wherever podcasts are available, whether it's Spotify or Apple or Flim Flam, the made-up podcast provider that I made up. 36 is a production of Soul Shop and B'nai Zion. You're going to enjoy it. And now you're going to hear what Ribari is going to say. It's incredible. Just keep on listening. Now back to this week's episode. It's really wild that like for thousands of years, what could have just been so forward and just made things so much more simple happened with the Abraham Accords. And like it makes you think that like what was so special about your team that all of you, Jared and David and Avi and I'm sure more did to actually get it done.
Yeah, I think what they did was exactly what people gave them a hard time. Everybody said they're not qualified, which is correct. They weren't qualified. Right?
It's so interesting.
But they came in and tackled a problem. Instead, you know what winds up happening? You and I can have a conversation about something for 20 minutes and be yelling at each other instead of listening to each other. Then somebody else walks into the room and says, oh, you guys actually see this the same thing. Just look at it this way. And so you had diplomats for the last 70 years who essentially created their own think tank ecosystem where they were always right because who were they talking to? Themselves. And this became the conventional groupthink of what needed to be in the Middle East. And then interject President Trump, an unusual president, who hired an unusual ambassador, David Friedman, had an unusual senior advisor, likely the most powerful person in the world at different points in time, Jared Kushner, incredibly well assisted by Avi Berkowitz, who, was spectacular. He's a native of this particular neighborhood.
Yeah,
and
I went to high school with him. He's a little older than me, but he was
bright, strategic. He might have had the hardest job in the entire administration, did a spectacular job of it. And together they looked at the problem set and came up with a different solution. And it started with Israel is not the problem, Israel is the solution, and said, how do we get there? And they traveled the region, they listened to the leaders, they understood what they wanted, and they were able to deliver it.
Particularly, everything you just said really inspires me, gives me chizuk, because like, I think so many times in life, we're always told or taught that like, leave it to the professionals to handle it. And obviously there's a lot of truth to that, but I think so many people go through their life and we usually, it's just natural to feel like a nobody. I mean, even myself, I'm doing these podcasts. I'm not the most polished person. There's definitely way better podcasters out there, but you know what? At the end of the day, it's like, I want to do this. I'm inspired to do it. And I think it works out because let's just do it and let's just be authentic about it. And when you're trying to do the right thing, and you have your head on straight, it really does work out. You put in the hard work, and it does work out, as proven here. Not
only does it work out, but you know what happens? If it doesn't work out, that opens up another door. And if you don't try it and you don't succeed, you have this level of passivity where people just sort of sit there and are responsive, and whether it's the phones or the TVs or the iPad, whatever else it would, that makes us passive, that's a terrible thing. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God did not want us to be passive. We have to be active partners, and the more we go ahead and outsource our life to so-called experts, the less good our lives are going to be. You saw this during COVID. Experts said stuff all the time. Where were the repercussions when experts were wrong? What happens to the experts who've decided the Middle East needed to be this way? And they were wrong. They're still the same experts. They're still the same people that are brought on TV to opine on all these various different things. We need less experts and we need more doers.
What particularly was so difficult for Avi's job that you mentioned that he had the hardest? Like, what was so hard about it? I'm not questioning. I'm asking.
I'm saying it is. Look, Jared had so many things on his portfolio, and Avi went from a position where he was really assisting Jared to a person who owned one of the most complicated portfolios, in the history of the world, Middle East peace. Right. And to be able to transition under the spotlight of a Trump White House, to be able to deal with all of the things that, everybody attacked Jared all the time. Right? I never once saw him lose his composure. I never saw him not be the most prepared guy in a meeting. I never saw him not sort of control the issue in a circumstance. And that comes not only from him, but obviously he had a great team. So Avi, who was part of his team and then had a portfolio in addition to that team, and people that the world don't know, but Charlton and Cassie, people who helped build this into something that changed the world in a meaningful way and never running for credit.
It's so interesting. I think those two, like, just obviously they're different people and with different accomplishments, but like Avi and Jared, I don't know at all. I know of them, but they both seem like very tznius, private. They do their thing, and you would think that very often those type of people, if I just describe them, like they're going to make such a big impact on the world, and it's kind of ironic, but I guess it makes sense that those are the kinds of people that actually do all the work. They're not running for every interview or every camera. They're like trying to stay behind the scenes as much as possible because they're like, we're just so focused on doing what we're doing.
Get
like,
the
we don't
job
have,
done.
Yeah, we don't have time for anything else.
Think about anything in your life that matters to you, your school, your shul, your camp, right? Your neighborhood. Who gets stuff done?
Right.
People who get stuff done are the people who get stuff done. And you know when you are in a pinch, who do you call? You call that person he or she because they get stuff done. That's what they did. They got stuff done. And it was my like enormous honor and pleasure to run after them and to get other stuff done. That way they can get their, bigger, higher level stuff done.
That's really cool. So could you tell us about that historic flight? The first that like it looked, I want to know what you did, what everyone did, and just what the emotions were.
So the key was in the middle of COVID is how do you put what we like to say meat on the bones? How do you take a piece of paper and make it peace in between people? So COVID, most people hadn't flown at any point in time since March of 2020. This is now August 13th. The first phone call happens. We want to accelerate the process of normalization. We want to make it normal for these countries to be connected with each other. And Jared and Avi said, get an El Al plane. We're going to fly over. We're going to have an American delegation, an Israeli delegation. We're going to fly over Saudi Arabia. We're going to land in Abu Dhabi, the capital of the United Arab Emirates, and we're going to begin negotiating the meat and potatoes of what it takes to have peace in between people and get that done. So we went back. We got a plane. We got an Israeli delegation. We set up an agenda and an itinerary for this, and we board the El Al plane. And only at that moment when we boarded the El Al plane did it hit me, holy moly, we're about to do something that has never been done before. And we got on an American delegation led by Jared Kushner and Avi Berkowitz and Robert O'Brien, who was the head of our National Security Council, and too many heroes to go into right now, but lots and lots of heroes. The Israeli delegation led by Meir Ben Shabbat, the head of the Israeli National Security Council, and about 25 or 30 members of the director generals of the Israeli ministries, plus a lot of press. We get on this plane, and the pilot announces we are the first El Al plane to ever fly from Israel to Abu Dhabi, United Arab Emirates, flying over the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And I've been on planes where you clap when you land. I've never been on a plane where there was a standing ovation upon takeoff.
Wow.
Now, the El Al stewardesses did what they did best. They yelled at us and went back to their seats.
That's so classic.
They did not yell at Jared. That also remains. Jared and Avi were unscarred by the circumstance, but there was this moment, and I think Avi tweeted it, and you just see this elation on takeoff. We fly over Saudi, and the pilot makes an announcement. We're flying over Saudi. We land in Abu Dhabi, and we're greeted royally. And if you want to see the picture that to me typifies both the Abraham Accords in 2020, it's a famous picture of the El Al plane in the background, and you have 8 or 9 or 10 Emiratis in their traditional kanduras, which is the traditional dress of the Emirati men, waving shalom to the El Al plane. And you saw that moment, and I'm like, who in the world would have ever had that on their bingo card of things that were going to be accomplished in 2020?
When you're on that plane, were you like, what is my life? Like, how did I get here?
There was not a day from the day that David and Tammy asked my wife and I to come that I didn't pinch myself and say, why am I so lucky in this specific opportunity? And because of that, I worked investment banker hours. I made no more money, right? But 22 hours a day, if there was something to get done, I wanted to give back to Ambassador Friedman and the United States of America and Jared and Avi the trust and the faith that they had put in us.
That's really crazy. Well, but particularly with this flight, what did you do on the flight? Obviously, hey, great, you stand up and like sit down. Like, do you learn? Do you watch a movie?
Correct. And what do you do once you sit? Once you sit down,
it's a long flight.
It's not so long. It's only 3 hours and 15 minutes.
A little shorter than I anticipated.
Yeah.
Okay.
So first of all, none of us slept the night before, so we all closed our eyes for a couple minutes.
Right.
And then we had an American team and an Israeli team. There's a lot of stuff to talk about.
Right.
We've got director generals of major ministries and us, and none of us had ever normalized relations with another country before. So we tried to game out every scenario of what it would be like. We land, and Jared and the senior team get into their very, very fancy cars, and they go off to meet with the senior leadership of the United Arab Emirates. Myself and all the director generals now get bussed in also very lovely cars. Don't feel badly for us. We get sent to the St. Regis Hotel in Abu Dhabi, and we're at the St. Regis Hotel, And it was this moment of the Israeli delegation walks in, and the Emirati director generals are all sitting in that room, and there was this sort of deer in the headlights. Everybody was ready for it. Everybody was excited for it. And then there was the, now what? And I look around, Vayifan chovacho vayar ki einish. I'm like, holy cow, I'm the American in charge of making sure that this goes well.
Oh my God.
And at that point in time, that was the moment of, this is terrifying. It should not have been me. But I look around and I'm like, okay, I'm going to get this done. And we organized everybody into the groups, and we had 8 different sections, and my job was to get everybody comfortable. And I come in and I introduce, and I said, look, the United States of America is proud of both of our allies, the United Arab Emirates and Israel, for being here. And I said, being here is a success. And if all we do is we go home and we exchange business cards, what we've done today is historic, and it's meaningful, and it matters, and thank you everybody for being here. And went from room to room, repeated the same speech, said, I'm here to unstick any problems. I'm here to advance any issues that you guys need. And myself and the team from the embassy there did our very, very best for that. And we had, after that, a dinner that evening where Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed made the entire hotel kosher for us that evening. That meant every person there, Jewish or not Jewish, would be comfortable with what it was that they were going to be able to eat there. There weren't many of the 70 of us who cared, but those of us who did were incredibly touched by that gesture. I mean, it was a very serious gesture. I went to the mashkiach who was there, and they flew in a mashkiach to do this.
Wow, they did their homework.
Correct. And said, well, how do I know which, vessels to use, which knives, forks, plates, etc.? He says, on the order of His Highness, every cutlery and glass and plate in the hotel has been replaced for the next 2 days. It's all brand new.
Wow.
It's all brand new at the St. Regis in Abu Dhabi. I was very moved by that. And then dinner finishes, and dinner, instead of taking 90 minutes, took 5 hours. People were so excited once we broke the ice. They were rotating and meeting and talking about space and visas and tourism and science and pandemic relief and education, all the things that people were there for. And then, okay, I wanted... Don't get over your skis. We finished. It was done. Everybody go to sleep. We're going to call this an enormous success.
Hold on.
Yeah.
What was the food like?
Delicious.
Yeah?
Yes. Delicious.
Okay.
Yeah. It was. Yeah. Without calling out one of the caterers over here, it was top level. Okay. It was very, very good.
Okay. Cool.
And conclude the evening, and I'm like, okay, success. Let's take a family picture. That's called a family picture. You get everybody together, and we've got the Israelis in suits and the Emiratis in traditional attire, and it's really a captivating picture.
Yeah.
And as I'm about to dismiss, my phone rings, and it's Maoz, who's I talk about in my book. He was my interlocutor. He was a former spy, who was my interlocutor with the Prime Minister's office on how they connected with these countries. He and I spent hours together every day. And he says, Aryeh, we've got a job to do. I said, what job do we have? He says, well, Mayor Ben Shabbat says we have to have a banking MOU worked out before we get on the plane tomorrow morning. I said, it's 11:30 at night. I just sent everybody to their rooms. We're not doing a banking MOU. He says, no, the mayor wants to get it done. I said, okay, fine, great. I don't work for the Israelis, so I was fine. Then I get a phone call from Jared.
Oh, gosh.
Jared's like, we got to get a banking MOU done. I'm like, we got to get it done. I called everybody back. We went to the smoking lounge of the St. Regis. There were cigars that evening, but we go in there, about 8 people on each side, and we're told that we're supposed to work out an agreement that under normal circumstances would take about 6 months of back and forth in between the top lawyers of other countries. And I'm told we have to have this done by 7 the next morning.
Wow.
And I said, once Jared says to get something done, said, can you have somebody call the Emiratis? He goes, believe me, they've been told. And the Emiratis were there and the Israelis were there, and we spent 6.5 hours that night working through the document. Again, I have no expertise in what these things are to look like. My job was to supply the Coke and the Diet Coke and the pretzels.
Your job is to make sure it gets done.
Just get it done.
Not in the nitty-gritty, but get it done.
Lock the door. Nobody's leaving until this thing is ready to be signed. And the next morning, we signed an MOU in between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, which allowed banking and finance transactions.
Can I bring you to DMV when I need to update my license? Because I feel like you'll get it done. It takes them years, but you'll get it done in a few minutes, I feel.
If I'm allowed to say that Jared Kushner says this needs to get done by this particular time, then likely that would be the case. So ultimately, I need to get
Jared to say,
yes,
this is getting done.
Yes,
and then it gets done.
That is correct. Yeah.
Wow. Do you feel like a lot of times, people, let's say sports players, they win the Super Bowl and then it's great, and then maybe their career's over, and then they go through the rest of their life. Do you feel like that was the highlight of your life, and now you're just, obviously you're living life, or no, that was just a certain great experience, great moment, and there's more to come?
I hope there's more to come, but on a professional level, if I never do anything that is as meaningful and fulfilling as that, I will be very satisfied on a professional level. On a spiritual level, there are always ways that we can fill that hole that we need to keep filling with. It's my wife, it's with my kids, it's with Torah, it's with friends. But on a professional level, when else am I ever going to get to do anything like that? So if there's another opportunity that comes around and I'm blessed enough to be in that same room when things like that happen, which that opportunity will come, whether it comes from me or not is a separate story. But peace in the Middle East is now a question of when, not if. So somebody will be in that room. And as Jared likes to say, he's a real estate guy. You build a project and it can pay dividends for even your grandkids. This was a project that I was privileged to play a role in that will pay dividends for my grandkids. So somebody will be in that room, whether it's in 3 years from now or 5 years from now or 15 years from now, as the rest of the countries that should be part of the Abraham Accords join. If I'm lucky enough to be in that room, I'll be thrilled. And if not, I'll be rooting them on. Republican or Democrat, this is an American ideal. It's really fantastic.
Does it feel surreal that like when kids are studying for like their history test, like your name could very likely come up when they're like studying?
It would be surreal. My kids would tell them the truth. They're like, I don't think what my Abba did was all that important. Although, it's not, you want to know a hysterical story? We had... my kids were in school in Israel, and this was like top secret what was going on. But the one person who was in on the whole thing was my daughter's ganenet. The lady who ran my daughter's gan said, how was she in on this? So every time I would go to a country to pregame the accords that would ultimately happen, I would come back and I would buy like a camel, like a stuffed doll camel, and it would say the name of the country on it for my daughter. If I go away for 2 days, she comes back and gets a stuffed camel. She would bring that camel to Gan. And the ganenet would see the camel, and she would say, well, what's going on? She says, my Abba was just there. So she didn't know with Abu Dhabi, that was brand new, but then Bahrain, and then Sudan. And she's like, wait, I know what's happening next. So once my daughter had a camel from Morocco, the ganenet said, this is coming. I'm like, okay, it's on its way.
That's the source. You find all the good, juicy info in preschool.
That is correct.
That's where you get all the good info.
That also might be where Israeli public education peaks in preschool. That's based on my personal experience.
So what's interesting is that, in hindsight, it looks like it's incredible what was actually took place, and it actually happened. Where I think if you asked someone 10 years ago that would any of this ever happen, starting with Trump becoming president, and then all of you pulling it off, like I would not have bet on it at all. So
if you did, you would have done better than last night's Mega Millions. I think at $850 million.
Yes, that is true.
That'd be the single greatest bet ever placed by anybody. Yes.
And in hindsight, it's like incredible. You look and like amazing, and now like you in retrospect, like oh my god, like it's perfect. But what people don't really know or see is the challenge that comes with it. What challenges did you or your family did you face or do you face because of all of this? I mean, you picked up and went to Israel.
Yeah, so you've got the family change, which anytime you move a family, you take some degree of risk. How will they adjust? Will there be rebellion? What's it like? With the Frumkite, moving from Woodmere to Renana is not a natural switch.
Right.
And I credit my wife both for having made the decision, but my kids being normal and adjusted and committed religious Jews is her credit, not mine. I ran around doing something else for 4 years. So she deserves the credit for that. So that was a risk. In terms of the professional risk, like I said before, each conversation that you have can have ramifications that you can never calculate. And on occasion, I'll speak off the cuff, and nobody should care what I say. Again, this was an ordinary person with an extraordinary opportunity. But when I got to see David and Jared and Avi, I saw that they measured each and every word, each and every reaction, each and every action. And I turned and I said, these are people who get the enormity of their job. They took their job incredibly seriously, but not themselves incredibly seriously. And that was a lesson that, I had to learn. I'm still learning. I hope to learn. But it was a really incredible lesson to be able to watch people do this in very real time.
Being in these countries that probably most of my listeners have never been there, and maybe never will. Oh, maybe they will be, thanks to you.
They would and they should.
They would and should. Were there ever any life danger, like moments that you were like, I am worried for my life?
Yeah, in Sudan, look, Abu Dhabi is the single safest city in the world, followed closely by Dubai. The safety there is incredible. There was concern going as an obvious Orthodox Jew for the first time what that would be like, but that was in my mind as opposed to in reality. So in my mind, I was nervous on my way the first time. The first time I went to an Arab Muslim majority country was Bahrain in 2019, and that was concerning or disconcerting for me. After I experienced being there, I learned that these are great friends and great allies, and what separates Israel and Bahrain is a political issue, not a religious issue. It's not ideological. It can be overcome. Same thing with UAE. When I had the chance to fly into Sudan, we did so undercover, and when our security, which were Mossad security guys, started removing all identifiable objects that would identify them as Israeli and recommended that I take off my kippah, that was the first time that I'm like, oh, perhaps volunteering for the negotiating with the Sudanese would not have been my top to-do list. And that was the only time that I benched Gomel when I returned. I went to Sudan several times, and each time when I came back from there was benching Gomel with Shema Malchus. There was no doubt about that. Yeah, that was disconcerting. And rightfully so, disconcerting.
Wow. Okay, so you just came out with a new book. Tell us about the book, and also why did you decide to write a book?
So the book is called Let My People Know, and within the title is exactly why I decided to write the book. It's the Abraham Accords. This is, I think, one of the most exciting things that have happened to the Jewish people, to the state of Israel and the United States of America and the Middle East in the last 70 years, right? The founding of the state of Israel, the Six-Day War, those things, game changers. This is right up there with that in terms of cementing Israel's place on the world stage, making it more peaceful and prosperous for the future, and people don't know about it. Now, they don't know about it maybe because President Trump was behind it, who any other president would have received a Nobel Prize, as would have Jared and Avi and David and others. Maybe it was because of the middle of COVID. I'm not positive why people don't know about it, but I know this: any relationship that you have, if you don't invest in it, it will wither. And we have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to change the Middle East forever. And if our listeners don't know about it, and their listeners' friends don't know about it, and their friends and the friends of the listeners don't know about it, then we've failed. So Let My People Know is to tell you about how the Abraham Accords happened, what are the Abraham Accords, and how to expand the Abraham Accords, because in my entire life, I will never be involved with anything more impactful than this. And if one new reader or one new listener has a chance to understand about this and does something because of that, I'll be thrilled that I spent all the time doing that.
That's amazing. And it sounds like this is just the beginning. Like there's so much more room to expand.
The Middle East is not perfect yet.
Right.
But I will tell you this, when you look at a place that I think can be a source of hope and optimism moving forward, can you imagine landing in Tel Aviv, ultimately going on a road trip and making it to Abu Dhabi, traversing Jordan and Saudi, and seeing historical sites, having kosher restaurants on the way, and being able to enjoy that part of the Middle East, having business traversing back and forth? 3 years ago, you wouldn't have imagined that.
I want to do a podcast from all these places. I legitimately.
And they will welcome you and be excited, and they will talk to you because they want to be understood. Do you know the Emiratis have fought with us in every battle that we've had since 9/11? You know what kind of decision that is for a Muslim majority country to decide to fight with the United States of America against other Muslim majority countries?
Wow.
They've made a decision how they want to be known in the future, but they haven't done a good enough job of communicating it to people. The Abraham Accords is one of these, as Winston Churchill describes it, the hinge of history, where the entire Middle East is going to pivot based upon Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed's decision to change the Middle East.
It's really wild. So I like to ask everyone a little more fun questions towards the end. So first off, do you have a favorite mitzvah from all 613?
Favorite mitzvah from all 613?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness, great question. My favorite mitzvah of all 613? I love the Shabbos table. And so if Oneg Shabbos is one of the 613, if I could sing, I would truly love it. And that would be but I enjoy hearing people sing. People don't enjoy hearing me sing. But that Shabbos table and that experience of listening and nobody's on their phone and everybody's talking, everybody's there and present and connecting, that's the mitzvah.
If there was one, and it's a beautiful answer, if there was one person in history or someone who's no longer with us that you could spend an hour with, who would it be and what would you talk about?
Am I allowed to have a toss-up, or you need only one?
You could do a toss-up.
Okay. It would be Ronald Reagan and or Menachem Begin.
Interesting. At the same time?
Oh, if I could sit with both of them, if I could do a podcast with Reagan and Begin and throw in Thatcher.
Oh, I like that. Maybe I should ask people like who you do a podcast with.
That would be
Thatcher.
pretty much the greatest thing ever.
Why Ronald? I think it's the first time someone answered Ronald Reagan. Why Reagan?
He changed the world in a meaningful way in our lifetime. He went from...
Not my lifetime.
Oh, no, that young? Shoot.
No, not that much younger, but I wasn't around.
My wife was only around for the second term of Ronald Reagan.
Really?
It's difficult to relate to her, but we're trying. I got
At
both
least
terms.
she got it in there.
Yes, correct. She got the better half. Going from Carter, where I think the United States of America was headed towards decline, there was other leadership in the world, and Reagan stood up and he said, if the United States of America is not the superpower, imagine what the world looks like. And it pivoted on that. And Begin had a similar thing. Says Israel is not going to be a recipient of charity. Israel is going to be the game changer in the region. And I don't think he knew how right he was going to be. But he felt in his heart that the Jews are not the Jews of the ghetto and the concentration camps, but the Jews are going to be the Jews who craft history moving forward. They change the future, and he was right about that also. And it's easy to say from where we're sitting right now, if you can remember 1979, which I can't, and neither can you, or if you can remember when Begin came into power also, this was not the state of Israel that we know. And people are able to change things. Jared Kushner, Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed, President Trump, even Netanyahu, these are incredible people. I'd like to meet the people who preceded them, Begin and Reagan being the two foremost of them.
And they rhyme, so it sounds better.
That would be good. That would be a podcast, Begin and Reagan.
Yeah,
yes.
That's it. We have your
Up
show.
in Shemaim, I'm sure they're very well listened to.
That's great, and it's also it's I guess the theme of this episode is that like they're also unlikely people that you wouldn't have really anticipated, and
That's
like
right.
look at what they did. What's the worst advice someone ever gave you?
The worst advice that somebody ever gave me was pretty aggressive in terms of trying to make myself well known during the U.S. Embassy time. Everything I had done prior to that, I'd worked for myself. I never really worked for anybody beforehand. So working for Ambassador Friedman was a change of the way I acted, the way I conducted myself, everything else like that. And somebody said, go make yourself ashamed. It took me about 3 seconds to realize that the greatest thing I could do right now is to learn from somebody. And again, I had one bad day at the office, and it pivoted very quickly. This had nothing to do with me. This has everything to do with Ambassador Friedman. It really has everything to do with the United States of America. And he was the representative of the president, and it was my job to make him have as much time to do the things that he cared about. None of it was about me, and it took a little bit of time in order to be able to figure that out. So the advice was go carve things out. Don't carve things out. There's a time where if you have a chance to learn from somebody who can be a meaningful impact, learn what it's like to be a mentee from a mentor.
That's such a good lesson, because I think at least now it's probably the internet's helping it out, but it's just like the nature of, the ability to really get out there and make a name for yourself with social media. It's a thing now, and that's such a good lesson to know that like in life there's obviously always a time and place for you to be the boss and run your show, but there's always a time to be learning from others, and I guess maybe that's the relationship with Hashem. Like he's the king and we're the ones serving him, and it's the best opportunity, and it's what we're meant to do,
Can I tell you a quick story from letting people know?
I love stories.
We were having dinner after the vice president came to Israel in January of 2018, and it was the vice president's team, the prime minister's team, and the embassy team, which was David Friedman and myself. I was lucky to be in that room, and everybody ordered steak because that's what we did, except for the chief of staff of the prime minister of Israel ordered fish, and everybody was ribbing him. Why are you ordering fish? And he turns and he says, do you know why this fish is on my plate? I'm like, no. He says, do you know why this fish is on my plate? No. Let me tell you why this fish is on my plate. Because it opened its mouth when it shouldn't have. Says I order fish to remind me when I'm supposed to open my mouth and when I'm not supposed to.
Wow. Well, he could do like steak, and then okay, it's part of a cow. But
that was his lesson. I enjoyed his lesson.
Yeah. Sorry for ruining the lesson. No, that's great. That's great. Is there a story that maybe happened in your life, or a moment, or maybe you heard it, so it didn't happen to you, that inspires you, gives you chizuk, made you a stronger person?
Yeah, there are too many to recount right now. I'll tell you one. Ambassador Friedman made a policy that we would visit every wounded and unfortunately the families of those who lost somebody in terror. And when he was either traveling to the States, to the White House, or otherwise occupied, that was my shlichut, that was my job. And I went to go visit in Hadassah Hospital the mother of a wounded soldier who was also a dual citizen, and went to go see her, and we were talking, and she jumps up from the middle of the meeting and goes to embrace this girl, 25, 26-year-old girl, and she's hugging her, and tears are just pouring down their cheeks, and they speak for 5, 7, 8 minutes. She comes back, and I said, is that your sister? Is that your daughter? Is that invite her to come sit? She goes, I don't even know her name. I said, well, that's a very emotional embrace for not knowing somebody's name. She says, let me tell you who she is. I said, who is she? I said, well, this young man was shot during a terror attack at the Aryeh Junction, and when the terror attack happened, her Jeep came down, this lady, and secured the area. And the Hatzalah, or Magen David Adom, I don't remember which life-saving organization, came to go rescue the 3 wounded people, 2 of them who I don't believe made it, and puts this young man into the ambulance, and he just looked at her and was afraid. And she violated her obligation. She was supposed to secure the area. She left her troops there. She got into the ambulance and held this kid's hand. And I don't know whether he was able to communicate, but she saw it in his eyes, and she held his hand the whole way from the Aryeh Junction to Hadassah Hospital. And when they got to Hadassah Hospital, they had obviously radioed ahead, and they had the chief of surgery was sitting there waiting to bring the kid in. And the chief of surgery turns to her and says, only family is allowed from here on out. And she goes, well, do you know who this kid is? He goes, no, we don't know who the kid is. We just heard that there was a wounded IDF prisoner. She goes, do you know his name? He says, no, we don't know his name yet. So she realized in her mind that obviously his family wasn't going to be there yet. So she goes, I'm his mom. She goes, I'm his mother. And until his mother gets here, I'm his mother. And this was the first time they had met. I mean, the last time they had met was the first time when the mom got there and they traded places with the real mom instead of this 25-year-old girl. And it taught me, it's a 25-year-old kid. Right, what a responsibility to secure a terror site, and then to have the presence of mind to ride with this soldier, and to have the presence of mind to sit there and hold this kid's hand until his actual mother showed up. And I just wonder, would we have done that? So I was very, very moved by that.
That's really beautiful. That's really beautiful and powerful. And yeah, thank you for sharing that. Well, if anyone's listening, I'm going to do an intro and outro, but if anyone's listening, they should definitely go buy your book. I assume they could buy it.
Buy it on Amazon.
Okay.
Get it at any of your local bookstores.
Nice.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Okay.
Should be exciting. Let my people know.
Let my people know. And yes, people, I mean, they got a taste of what's in the book. Here, don't worry, everyone listening.
Just a little taste.
There's a lot more to it.
There's more in the book.
Thank you so much for, I mean, I assume you came in from Renata specifically for this interview.
That is correct. I'm leaving right now.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. And it was a privilege. It was really a privilege. You know, I'm dealing with someone. I was talking to someone who's literally doing phone calls all day with Jared Kushner and very, very powerful people in the world. And it's always a delight to get to know these kinds of people, because they, you know, someone like Aryeh Lightstone is like someone that is such a mensch. He's such a, I don't know how to say it better, he's such a normal guy. You know, you hear about all these people, you know, helping run the world, and you think that they're gonna be something very, very interesting or strange about them, and like you meet him and you're like, what a delight, what a great person. And someone like him really gives me chazek. You know, I feel like I know we all have our mission in life, and it's sometimes complicated to really know what our mission is and who we should be, but I think he's a great example of once you find it and you put in the hard work, it's what you're meant to do, and there's no greater feeling to be doing what your purpose is. So kudos to him. Go buy his book. It's in the show links. Go buy his book. It's phenomenal, and this was a taste of it. Just a taste of the details, and I don't know. I call him the American James Bond. I mean, I don't know if he has a license to kill, but he's there. He's doing secret stuff and really changing the world. So kudos to him. And go ahead and listen to 36. You could type it in. It's spelled the way it sounds, not numbers, but with letters. And you really get to hear the fascinating, incredible people on that podcast. And go ahead and share this episode with people that you think would enjoy it. Share it with people like Yaakov Linger, who don't really know much about politics, but really are interested in to hear actually what happens in an interesting way. I think Aryeh has a great talent of making things that probably are dry really interesting, and really explaining the core and essence of it in a great way. And who knows, if you share this with someone, maybe one day they'll make the Isaac Accords or the Jacob Accords. Is that a thing? I don't know. Or maybe they'll extend the Abraham Accords. Either way, keep on being inspirational. Thank you so much for listening. Living L'chaim.